Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, keeping company on a long drive, or simply searching for stillness in a noisy world, this story is here for you. Because tonight, we begin a quiet journey through the frozen heart of Ice Age America. This is calm storytelling for thoughtful minds. It is the untold story of a land shaped by cold and silence, of a continent waiting in stillness for the first footsteps to arrive, nearly 20,000 years ago. But this is not a story of conquest or of cities or of kings. It begins not with monuments, but with bones in the snow. And you know, if you find yourself drawn to long-form poetic storytelling about the ancient past, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this kind of careful work reach more wandering minds like yours. By the way, what time is it for you right now, and where in the world are you listening from? If you feel like sharing, you can drop it in the comments below. We are many, but we are listening together. Also, if sleep finds you during this journey, that's perfectly fine. Timestamps are in the description if you return later. Now, let us begin. With a land beneath the ice that had never known a human step. The story of Ice Age America does not begin with humans. It begins with the land itself. With a continent shrouded in silence, locked beneath cold sky and sweeping wind, waiting for a story to arrive. This is not a tale of nations or borders. It is the memory of a continent that once existed as a dream beneath ice and cloud. And it begins in the far northwest, where the land once stretched out in ways it no longer does, where Asia touched Alaska not with water, but with earth. In what is now the Bering Strait, there once lay a vast and exposed landmass known as Beringia. This was not a mere corridor between two worlds. It was a world of its own. A steppe stretching for over 1,000 miles from Siberia to Alaska, across what is now the floor of the sea. Covered in grass and low shrubs, swept by winds, bounded by glaciers. It was not frozen, but it was cold, dry, open, and alive. Here walked the giants, mammoths, short-faced bears, ancient horses. Herds moved like shadows across the plains. Snow buntings rose in flocks from sun-crusted tundra. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed along icy rivers, and behind them, at first unseen, came the humans, small groups, always moving, always watching. The first humans to enter Beringia were likely descendants of the same line that once moved through Siberia in the late Pleistocene. But something happened here that would shape their destiny. They did not immediately pass through. They stayed, for thousands of years. Genetic evidence suggests a long pause in this place, a population bottleneck, an isolation. This is sometimes called the Beringian standstill. It is not just a hypothesis, it is a pattern in our DNA, a slow rhythm in the double helix that points to a people who waited, a people who survived in the narrowing space between continent and cold, who adapted, not by fleeing, but by staying. They lived in a place that no longer exists, a land that lies beneath the waves now. But we find its echoes in the bones, in the blades, in the subtle differences in genes passed down through generations, in the fact that all indigenous peoples of the Americas share markers that seem to trace back to this time and this place. Beringia held its breath, and in that breath, a people were shaped. By wind, by hunger, by time. They hunted caribou, they fished in ice-lined streams, they wrapped themselves in furs, they learned to make fire in the snow, they learned to wait. And so the story begins not with movement, but with stillness. Not with a crossing, but with a pause. Not with a bold step into a new land, but with a long quiet inhalation before that step was taken. A pause that would echo forward into the bones of every human to ever walk the Americas. This was Beringia, the land that held its breath, and the people who learned to live inside that breath are the ones who would one day shape an entire hemisphere. But shaping something as vast as a continent does not begin with intention. It begins with persistence, with the slow choreography of survival across landscapes that offered little and demanded everything. In the long dusk of the Pleistocene, the people of Beringia moved through their frozen world with care. There were no maps, only memory, no shelter, but what could be carried or built from bone and snow, and yet they endured. Archaeological traces in parts of Alaska and eastern Siberia suggest a remarkable capacity for cold adaptation. They worked stone flakes into narrow spear points, They used sinew and wood to lash together simple tools. Their clothing, though long gone, would have mirrored the animals they studied. Thick hide, layered furs, tightly bound around the body to preserve every breath of warmth. The wind here never stopped. It howled across the steppe, carving the snow into ridges and ripples. There were no trees. Firewood was gathered from wind-blown shrubs or scavenged from driftwood. The fire pits they left behind were shallow and ringed with stone. Their heat would have been precious, brief, and essential. Even in this marginal land, the people learned to live in rhythm with the migrations. Caribou, muskox, Arctic hare. Some followed the animals across long distances, others set traps or waited near watering holes. The hunt was not only for food, it was for sinew, for hide, for bone. The animal was used entirely, nothing wasted, every part a tool. Every death a gesture of continuation. And then there was the cold itself, not merely an environmental condition, but a constant presence, a shaping force. The children born in Beringia would have known the cold before they knew language. They would have seen their first mammoth as a moving hill of fur and breath. They would have learned to sleep in shelters of snow and skin, to listen for predators in the dark. And yet they did more than survive. They passed knowledge forward. They formed families. They returned to the same sites again and again. Some archaeologists believe that specific areas of Beringia show signs of repeated occupation over centuries. Tools sharpened on the same stones, fires lit in the same pits. This was not random movement. It was patterned, intentional. It was a kind of rootedness, even in a land where roots could not grow. For a people waiting to cross into a new world, Beringia was not a place of exile. It was home, a home carved from wind and silence, a home that asked much and gave little, but gave enough. And somewhere in that long twilight something began to change. The cold began to loosen, the glaciers began to melt, and the land, still holding its breath, prepared for movement. This change was not sudden. In deep time, even dramatic events unfold like the turning of a page in silence. The Great Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, which had locked North America in a frozen grip, began to retreat. Slowly, imperceptibly, a few meters each year. But that was enough. Where once there had been only walls of ice, there were now cracks, passages, softening edges. To the south of Beringia, the possibility of movement began to stir. Some scientists believe that a corridor opened between the two massive ice sheets, running down through what is now Western Canada. A narrow path between frozen giants. Others argue that the first people did not wait for this inland route at all, that they followed the coast instead, walking along the edge of the Pacific, navigating beaches and tidal pools where kelp forests still swayed in the current. But before either route could be taken, before any crossing into what we now call the Americas, there had to be preparation. And the bones speak to that. So do the blades. Stone tools found in parts of eastern Beringia, in what is now Alaska, suggest a continuity of occupation that spans thousands of years. These were not throwaway objects. They were sharpened with care. Fluted for precision. The points are elegant in their simplicity, and their presence speaks of people who are not lost but ready. One toolmaker flaked stone beneath the howl of wind, shaping a weapon to bring down a caribou. Another carved a bone needle to mend a torn hide. A mother passed knowledge to her child, not in words, but in gesture and repetition. A father taught his son to read the snow for tracks. A community gathered around fire to share the meat of a mammoth, its fat crackling on the flames. We have no written record, but the evidence is still there, scattered like ash in the soil. Hearths, scrapers, awls. The remnants of a people who lived not at the edge of the world, but at the centre of their own. And then there were the first steps, across the softening land, along new rivers formed from meltwater, into valleys no human had seen, across hills where only the wind had ever stood still. The first movements south would not have been grand expeditions. They were likely small, cautious migrations, a few families, a few packs, a few dreams. They did not know they were entering a new continent. They only knew they were following animals, following seasons, following possibility. But in that following, something irreversible began. The breath that Beringia had held for so long was finally exhaled, and that exhale would become the long, slow unfolding of Ice Age America. What followed was not an explosion of movement, but a deep migration that flowed like glacial melt through stone-carved channels. People did not flood into the Americas overnight. They trickled forward, they paused, they learned. Each step was measured against hunger, against weather, against memory. These were not conquerors. They were families, travellers, story-bearers walking into lands that no human had ever seen. And yet, the land was not empty. It was filled with presences, herds of mammoth, packs of dire wolves, slopes carved by muskox and scraped by ancient bison. The sky itself was not silent, but stirred with the wings of condors, cranes, and ice-drifting gulls. To walk into this place was to enter an untouched dream of life, vast and strange and brimming with danger. In what is now western Alaska, traces of this cautious expansion begin to appear. The earliest human sites are modest. A scatter of flakes from tool-making, a fire pit marked by discoloured soil, the charred remains of bone. These are not monuments, they are murmurs, but they speak. They speak of a kind of intelligence tuned to subtlety, to learning where the wind carries scent, to hearing the difference between snow packed by hoof or by claw, to knowing how to move silently through open ground with no cover. And perhaps most remarkably, these early travellers did not come alone. They came with knowledge preserved across generations, how to work obsidian for clean edges, how to twist sinew into thread, how to skin a caribou without piercing the hide. This was not instinct, it was memory, and it moved through the human body as surely as breath or blood. We see it in the continuity of tool forms, in the shared shapes of projectile points found from Beringia to the southern plains, in the way fire was arranged, not chaotically, but carefully. Even when the people moved, they left behind a pattern, a whisper of design. These early migrations were not aimless. They were directional, responsive, layered with intent, and that intent was not simply to survive, but to sustain, to ensure that others could follow, that children could be born in a world made slightly more familiar by the bones left behind. So Beringia was not forgotten. Even as the people moved forward, they carried it with them, in their tools, in their customs, in their stories. The land may have sunk beneath the sea, but it remained a place of origin, a remembered homeland beneath the waves. And as the ice continued to melt and the animals began to shift their ranges, the people shifted with them, southward, eastward, into the deep heart of a continent that had never known a human name, but soon would. That movement did not begin with the rush of exploration, but with the slow drift of familiarity. These were not strangers to the cold, they were people shaped by it. Their instincts had been tempered by long winters, short days, and the long memory of wind. And the land they entered did not resist them. It opened in silence. What they found was not untouched wilderness, but a vast mosaic of possibility. Plains stretched beyond the horizon, herds moved like rivers. The sky was wide and wild. There were no markers, but there were signs. Patterns in the grass where animals had passed, meltwater streams edged with tracks, the soft hollows where sleeping mammoths had left their warmth behind. They did not come to conquer, they came to belong. Their movements were cautious, shaped by necessity, guided by knowledge older than any map. They paused to gather roots. They watched the birds for signs of weather. They followed the herds with a kind of reverence, and when they stopped, they lit fires and shaped tools. They carved their presence gently into the earth. In the soil we find their echo, a chipped blade, a cracked bone, a hearth blackened with ash. These are not ruins, they are the faint outlines of memory, the evidence of a people who did not simply pass through, but began to dwell. Their presence can still be read in the stratified layers of ice and earth. Their tools suggest learning passed between generations. Their survival was not luck, it was pattern, it was patience. And though the land they had left behind would one day vanish beneath the sea, it did not vanish from them. They carried Beringia in their bodies, in their blood, in their sense of how to live with a place rather than against it. The lessons of that long pause did not fade. They flowed forward, into the migrations that followed. As they walked deeper into what is now Alaska, and beyond, they followed more than game trails. They followed memory, a landscape of belonging, unfolding one horizon at a time. The breath that had been held for so long had not disappeared. It had simply become motion. That motion would take them farther than they knew, across tundra, along rivers, through mountains not yet named. The continent was opening slowly in silence, and in that silence, a people moved, quietly, enduringly, carrying with them the first trace of story. But how do you walk through a world that was never meant for footsteps? Where Alaska meets the mountains of western Canada, a narrow passage once carved its way between walls of ice. To either side stood the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, frozen giants that had buried much of North America in white silence. But at their meeting point, something strange happened. A seam opened. Not a road, not a valley, but a corridor, winding, shifting, cold, and alive. Geologists believe that this ice-free corridor began to form sometime after 20,000 years ago. It may have taken millennia to fully open, or perhaps it opened in pulses, appearing, narrowing, and reappearing with the slow breathing of the ice. The evidence is still debated. Radiocarbon dates are precise, but the land beneath ice does not always speak clearly. Still, the clues we have suggest a critical window of possibility, a time when early humans could have passed south through this frozen throat and emerged into the untouched interior of Ice Age America. But possibility does not mean ease. This was no gentle trail. It was an exposed path bordered by glaciers that scraped the sky. There were no forests here, no shelter. The ground was raw, scoured. In some places it may have been marshy with meltwater. In others dry and choked with glacial dust. Plants had only begun to return. Animals were few. This was not a promised land. It was a place of passage. And yet, someone walked it. In what is now Alberta and British Columbia, scientists have found hints of this early inland migration. Fossilized animal dung, layers of pollen, the bones of waterfowl and bison. Together, they suggest a living environment, a patchwork of open ground and seasonal refuge. Not lush, but passable. Not welcoming, but possible. The question is not whether people could have passed through. The question is whether they chose to, and if they did, how they survived. Perhaps they travelled in small groups, families carrying all they owned in bundles of hide and bone. They would have followed the animals, geese, elk, perhaps even mammoths, though fewer in number now. They would have burned dried grass or dung for fire, melted snow for water, slept under stretched skin, and walked, always walked. If they paused, we find no villages, no great sights, but we do find signs. A worked stone near an ancient lake, a flake of obsidian far from its origin, the ash of a fire buried deep in the earth. These are not grand discoveries, but they are enough. They are enough to suggest that someone passed this way. Someone endured the long path southward through a land shaped by cold and silence. Someone left behind not words, but clues, and the corridor they followed would not stay open forever. It was a door in the ice, a passage through time, and for a while it let them through. To imagine this place now, one must strip away the forests and cities, the grids and glowing roads. The ice-free corridor was not carved for comfort. It was carved by absence. The absence of ice where once there was only ice. What remained was the memory of movement. A long, narrow clearing, flanked on both sides by walls of frozen silence, stretching from what is now the Yukon into the heart of the continent. In that corridor, each step was an act of patience, and perhaps of faith. There is a theory, still debated, that this route offered one of the earliest inland passages into Ice Age America. But even among scientists, the question remains unsettled. Was it open early enough to allow entry before the Great Clovis Horizon? Were the conditions livable, or merely survivable? The dates shift with each new find. A scatter of tools, a cache of bones, a sliver of wood darkened by fire. The evidence is thin, but it persists. What we know for certain is that the corridor, once opened, became a kind of inland artery. Not a path of conquest, but a narrow ribbon of opportunity. A way for people to move deeper into the unknown. And as they moved, they would have encountered a landscape in flux. The ice walls, always present, creaked and groaned in the distance. The ground was often unstable, pocked with meltwater pools and braided rivers. The air hung heavy with moisture. Glacial dust settled on everything, a fine grey powder blown from the grinding teeth of the ice. Visibility may have been poor, storms sudden, and yet they continued. The animals knew the path too. In the traces of bison and waterfowl, we find the first hints of seasonal migration through this land. Where animals go, people follow, and in following they adapted. The corridor forced decisions: which direction to take, where to camp, how to cross melt-choked channels, when to stop and when to press forward, and so each choice became a thread in a larger story. A story of not just survival, but expansion. Somewhere along this passage tools were dropped, stones chipped into blades. One might imagine a hand smoothing a flake, eyes scanning the cold horizon, the breath visible even in summer. These were not idle moments. They were decisions etched in motion. And each tool left behind speaks of more than its function. It speaks of the person who held it, the rhythm of their steps, the shape of their hunger. If they left fire behind, it has long since cooled. But the charcoal remains, buried beneath layers of dust and time, waiting. In that waiting, we glimpse something more than a route. We glimpse the early unfolding of a continent's memory, the slow pulse of footsteps through a land not yet mapped, but already sacred in its scale. A path that did not yet lead to cities or borders, but to survival, to presence, to continuity. And beneath that continuity lies a deeper layer of silence. For even as the corridor allowed passage, it also imposed isolation. There were no villages along this narrow route, no networks of trade, no known gathering places. This was not the cradle of civilization. It was the narrow hallway between two forgotten rooms. In what is now central Alberta and the northern plains of Montana, the land still bears the faint impressions of this movement. Shallow basins that once held glacial melt now cradle lakes and wetlands. Low ridges of till mark the retreat of ancient ice. And scattered in this shifting geography are clues, not many, just enough to suggest that people passed through, and that in passing, they survived. Kill sites tell part of the story. Fossilized remains of bison and extinct horses have been found in these transitional zones. Some bear marks of human activity. Bones cracked for marrow, skulls split cleanly along the midline. These are not accidents of scavenging, they are decisions. They are the visible result of knowledge applied to the edge of hunger, and around these kill sites we find flakes of stone, tools discarded after use, some broken, some still sharp, often made of materials not local to the area, suggesting movement, suggesting memory. A person who carries a blade made from distant obsidian is also carrying a map, a mental geography of where to find what is needed and how to bring it forward. In Europe, Ice Age humans left painted caves and carved figurines, but in the Americas they left something else, less visible, no great art, no underground sanctuaries. Here, the story was told in presence itself, in the way a spear was shaped, in the way a group moved across the land and returned to the same site season after season, generation after generation. The corridor amplified that silence. It forced each human decision to echo more sharply against the absence of shelter and ease. There were no trees to carve into totems, no stone overhangs to paint. But there was the body, there was movement, there was fire. What they built, they carried. What they believed, they remembered. And that memory was shaped by the land itself, by the long blue shadows of ice, by the unpredictable winds, by the knowledge that one wrong turn could mean isolation, or disappearance, or death. Still, they walked. Each fire lit in that corridor was not just for warmth, it was an act of defiance, of belonging, of orientation. A place claimed not through force, but through endurance, and in that firelight, if we could see them now, we might not recognize their faces, but we would recognize their hands, roughened by work, holding bone tools, passing stones from one person to another, teaching by doing, and always, quietly, moving forward. The landscape demanded that kind of learning. There were no guides, no waypoints carved into stone, just the endless sound of water melting from ice and the low hum of wind between the glaciers. It was not a place where people settled, it was a place they passed through, and yet, for a time, it held them. This corridor may have been open for only a few hundred years, or perhaps a few thousand. The dates vary. Some researchers place the viable window around 13,000 years ago, others argue for an earlier opening. The soil resists easy answers, the melt cycles were unpredictable, and the land beneath the retreating ice was raw, unstable, sometimes lifeless, sometimes blooming with new life. In some places plant species returned quickly, grasses, birch, willow. In others the ice had left behind only gravel and dust. Still people came through, and in coming they began to leave a fingerprint on the interior of the continent. What we know comes not from monuments but from the smallest of things. A tooth buried in glacial silt, a burned patch of ground beneath a collapsed moraine, an antler point sharpened to pierce hide. These are not symbols, they are not messages, but they are presence. They are the physical remains of thought and action, of people who watched the same sky and waited for the same thaw. And the corridor itself was more than just a place between ice. It was a narrowing of possibility, a place where choices became survival, which valley to follow, which river to cross, when to wait, when to risk. And in these choices, culture began to bend around the landscape, not to dominate it, but to answer it. This is the American story before agriculture, before mythic ancestors and named gods, a time when the land itself was the teacher, when the space between ice became a kind of threshold, not sacred in the ceremonial sense, sacred in the way that every breath taken in extreme places becomes a form of prayer, and perhaps the memory of this corridor lived on, passed through oral tradition, woven into migration tales, encoded in the routes people still walk. Because the first movements that flowed through this passage did not stop at its southern edge. They spread outward, into the plains, into the forests, into what would become the cultural heartlands of later millennia. This is why the corridor matters, not only as a possible route of entry, but as a crucible, a place where early American lifeways were stripped to their essence. Movement, fire, family, patience, the things that survive when everything else is frozen. And though the ice would eventually recede and forests would return, the shape of that narrow path remains, pressed into the land like a forgotten footstep, holding even now the memory of the first travellers who crossed it. That memory does not shout. It does not appear in great stone circles or in buried cities. It lingers instead in the rhythm of bones, in the pattern of tools, in the soil darkened by ancient fires. The corridor was a place of passage, but also of compression. A place where life was narrowed to its most essential elements: movement, observation, persistence, and the quiet instinct to adapt again and again. In what is now the interior of Western Canada, glacial remnants still shape the terrain. Long lakes fill valleys once scoured by ice. U-shaped canyons open onto plains. Beneath this landscape, archaeologists have recovered only faint evidence. A hearth dated to 12,600 years ago, a flake of stone lying far from its source, scattered bones with cut marks. Not enough to tell a full story, but more than enough to suggest that stories were lived here. The corridor may have only allowed a small number of people to pass at any given time, but those who did pass carried knowledge that had been refined over generations in the north. They knew how to butcher large animals quickly, how to store fat, how to read cloud shapes and snowdrifts. These skills moved with them like fire carried in a sealed ember pouch, and once released into new landscapes, they bloomed. The people who emerged from the corridor stepped into a different world. The ice fell behind them like a door closing. Ahead lay open plains, dense forests, rivers still carving their names into the earth. It was not yet a homeland, but it was fertile with possibility. The corridor was never a destination. It was a test, a transition space. In the old stories told across cultures, there is often a place between worlds, a thin space where things change. The ice-free corridor may have been just such a place where the memory of one world was carried into another, not through conquest, but through breath, through footsteps, through quiet acts of making do. And though other paths may have existed, along the Pacific coast, through frozen archipelagos, even over highland trails yet undiscovered, the corridor holds its own kind of sacred gravity, not because it was the only way, but because it was one way, a hard way, a way that asked something of those who entered it and gave nothing freely. Yet the people came, and when they emerged into the interior of the continent they were changed. Not in body perhaps, but in memory, in the stories they would tell, in the way they would approach the next river, the next hill, the next long season. Because the ice had taught them something about endurance, about the sound of nothing but wind, about walking together when the world narrows around you, and that lesson would echo long after the glaciers had melted into the sea. But could the oldest American roads have been made of seaweed and tide? Along the western edge of the continent a different kind of path emerged, not carved in stone or pressed into soil, but traced along the restless margins of the Pacific Ocean. From the islands of Alaska down through what is now British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, and further still into the coasts of California, Baja, and beyond, the shoreline became a corridor of its own, a ribbon of opportunity where land met water, where the sea gave more than the earth could spare. This was the Kelp Highway. Scientists use the term to describe a theory. That early human migration into the Americas may not have been limited to inland passages, but also followed the coast. That small bands of seafaring people may have travelled down the shoreline, using simple boats or rafts, harvesting shellfish, seaweed and fish, and that this watery trail may have brought people south long before the ice-free corridor ever opened. The evidence is sparse, but growing. In the caves of the Channel Islands, off the coast of Southern California, archaeologists have found ancient tools, stemmed projectile points, scrapers, bonefish hooks, some more than 12,000 years old. Along the beaches of British Columbia, waterlogged sites have yielded hearths and stone flakes. In the peat bogs of coastal Chile, at a site known as Monte Verde, fibres, tent stakes, and preserved seaweed point to a human presence over 14,000 years ago. Possibly more. If these finds are accurate, they shift the story. They suggest a different origin, a different pace, and a different kind of relationship between humans and the land, or rather, between humans and the sea. The Pacific coast was not empty. It was abundant. Kelp forests lined the shallows, teeming with fish and shellfish. Seals and sea lions basked on rocky outcrops. Birds nested in cliffs. The ocean, cold and rich with upwelling nutrients, offered a rhythm of sustenance that repeated with the tides, and it offered predictability. Unlike inland environments, which changed drastically with the retreat of glaciers, the coast provided a relatively stable corridor, a line of survival, not easy, but consistent. And for people trained to watch the sea, to feel its patterns, to read the weather in the clouds and the behaviour of birds, it may have offered something even more precious than food. Direction. Where inland groups followed herds across grasslands, the coastal people followed the shoreline itself, a line that never truly ended, only curved. And as they followed it, they began to leave behind a different kind of trace. Not footprints in the sand, but the quiet residue of presence, shell middens, charcoal. A fish spine burned just enough to last 10,000 years. The sea, which once threatened to erase all, had instead preserved a few small whispers, enough to let us know they were here, and those whispers speak of a way of life shaped not by the struggle to cross glacial corridors, but by the rhythms of the tide. In what is now the Channel Islands of Southern California, stone tools have been recovered from caves overlooking the Pacific. These are not inland camps. They are coastal dwellings, positioned high enough to see the sea, yet close enough to reach it in a few short steps. Here, the first Americans lived not behind walls of ice, but beside the flicker of waves and the call of gulls. The tools found in these islands are not unlike those discovered further north, along the coasts of Alaska and British Columbia. Stemmed points, scrapers, bone needles. These shapes repeat across thousands of kilometres, not identical but related, variations on a shared language of stone, carved not for ceremony but for use, for filleting fish, for shaping hide, for sewing sea lion skin into something warm enough to wear while paddling cold water. The presence of these tools suggests something remarkable, not just that people lived along the coast, but that they moved, they travelled, island to island, shore to shore, possibly in simple boats made of hide stretched over wooden frames, or perhaps in dugouts, hollowed from driftwood. We do not yet know. The sea rarely preserves such things, but the distances between the islands are not small. They require intent, planning, navigation. And that tells us something about these early coastal people. They did not see the ocean as a barrier, they saw it as a path, a source of life, a teacher. While the great Eurasian caves echoed with painted bison and mammoth, the coastal peoples of ancient America left no such images behind. Their stories may have been carried in the lines of kelp that drifted on the tide. In the flight of seabirds overhead, in the return of salmon to the same stream each year, their rituals may have been bound to the turning of the moon, their sacred places marked not by carvings, but by return. The same cove, the same rock, the same harvest of mussels year after year. This is a different kind of memory, a memory stored not in walls but in practice. Along the coast of what is now Oregon and Washington, shell middens lie buried beneath layers of earth, thousands of years of discarded shells, mussel, clam, oyster, each one a small decision, a moment of nourishment, a life taken and consumed. When scientists dig through these middens, they find more than diet. They find patterns, seasonality, preference, even trade. Obsidian from inland sites appears here, among the shells, a reminder that the coast was not isolated. It was connected to rivers, to mountains, to interior bands of people who may have never seen the ocean, but who knew what came from it. The shoreline was not the edge, it was the beginning, a boundary that was also a thread, a place where life and land braided together in salt, stone, and memory. The Pacific coast offered something the interior did not, a stability of abundance, even when the climate shifted. Even when the glaciers advanced or retreated, the ocean remained, its tides moved with the moon, its kelp forests absorbed the sun, its shoreline delivered driftwood, seaweed, fish, and birds. This rhythm may have been the oldest teacher of all, and the people responded. They shaped tools not for hunting herds across Great Plains, but for slipping fish from tidal pools. They crafted nets from plant fibers, lines from twisted sinew, hooks from bone and shell. These tools were light, portable, made to move with the tide, to be carried from one rocky inlet to the next. In what is now southeastern Alaska, sites like Groundhog Bay and Hidden Falls have revealed tools made from whalebone and sharpened antler. Not the signature Clovis points of the interior, but something smaller, more adapted to the coast, blades designed for slicing kelp, carving bark, or stripping fat from seal hide. Each piece is a clue, a fingerprint, a survival strategy shaped by water rather than land. And these strategies worked. Wherever the sea allowed landing, there are signs of presence. Fire rings darkened with charcoal, clamshells arranged in discarded heaps, bones split and roasted, not once, but again and again, a rhythm of return. This repetition is what turns landscape into homeland. A cove is not sacred because it is dramatic. It is sacred because people keep coming back, and some sites suggest just that. A pattern of occupation across centuries, a place where children may have watched the same tide their grandparents once harvested from, where knowledge passed not in books or symbols, but through hands, through watching, through doing. And it was not only about food. The coast demanded observation, the cycles of the moon, the wind across the bay, the sudden absence of birds before a storm. These were not idle facts. They were the difference between drowning and return, between famine and feast. The people learned to read the signs not as metaphors, but as instructions, and over time that attention may have become belief, ritual, story. In the old world, the sacred often rises in vertical stone, temples, monoliths. In Ice Age America, the sacred moves horizontally. It follows the shoreline, it echoes in the shell beds and fire pits. It appears not as spectacle, but as echo. And the sea preserved more than bones. In the peat layers of Monte Verde in southern Chile, scientists discovered something rare. Twisted seaweed. Preserved for over 14,000 years, carried inland, possibly dried for storage. Evidence not only of diet, but of planning, of memory, of culture shaped by coastlines. And that coastline still remembers. It holds the sound of wind between spruce trees, the echo of feet on wet sand, the small circles of fire left behind in salt-stung earth. It remembers the hands that built nothing permanent, but left everything behind. These early coastal people were not just foragers moving through. They were carriers of pattern, of lifeways tuned to a shoreline that shifted constantly but changed very little. And in their movement, they built something we can still glimpse, not monuments, but middens, not altars, but fire rings, and these clues begin to form a picture. In what is now Haida Gwaii, an island archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia, teams of researchers have found evidence of ancient campsites just above the current high tide line. Radiocarbon dating of wood charcoal, sea mammal bones, and tools places human activity here as far back as 13,000 years ago. Some sites, once coastal, are now submerged. The sea has risen, but the memory remains. Haida Gwaii was never part of the mainland. To reach it, people had to travel over water. And they did, repeatedly. The tools found there match those found further south, but there are differences too. Regional variations, subtle shifts in shape and use. This is how we know the people were not simply repeating themselves. They were adapting, innovating, responding, and the ocean rewarded them. Sea otters, seals, fish migrations timed with the season, kelp forests offering both food and shelter, birds returning in their thousands to nest on rocky cliffs. The sea offered a different kind of abundance than the mammoth plains or the tundra valleys. It required different tools, a different eye. But for those who learned its patterns, it offered consistency. The materials they used tell us something else, the presence of plant fibre rope, of woven mats, of baskets sealed with pitch. These are not relics of wandering bands. These are the technologies of people who planned, who returned, who built temporary shelters knowing the sea would always be there. And beneath these patterns lies something older still, the idea that the coast itself was a guide, a line not just of food, but of belonging. The kelp forests may have been the markers, like green threads lacing the edge of a continent. Where the kelp grew thickest, the waters were most alive, and so were the people. It is possible that this coastal migration extended far earlier than we can prove, that the footprints of the first Americans were not left on glacial mud, but on tidal flats now swallowed by the sea. Most coastal sites older than 10,000 years have vanished beneath rising oceans, but the few that remain speak clearly. They speak of people who followed not stars, but currents, and perhaps that is why their story feels quieter, more elusive, because the waves have hidden much of what they touched. But in those spaces between tide and stone, we still find hints, enough to know that this was not the edge of the world. It was a beginning. And it was travelled often. The Pacific coast was not a place of arrival and abandonment. It was a world unto itself, a biome with its own rules, its own tempo, its own demands. And for those who listened closely, it offered a kind of knowledge that would echo far beyond the shoreline. Knowledge of wind, of kelp, of how to split a clam without breaking the shell, of how to read the fog when it thickens against the cliffs. In this world, the sacred may have looked different. There were no towering statues or carved cave walls, but there were sites of return, beaches that held the same tide pools generation after generation. Rock smoothed by countless hands, a place where a seal was once butchered, then again a decade later, then again a century after that. These acts, repeated in silence, are not ordinary. They are memory made real. In the southern reaches of the continent at Monte Verde in Chile, the evidence deepens. There, preserved in wet peat, archaeologists found not just tools but fibre, twisted strands of cord, fragments of wood, plants that had been chewed, tent stakes still resting where they had been pressed into earth over 14,000 years ago, and beside them, seaweed. Several species, some cooked, some dried. All carried with care from the coast inland. This is not random foraging, it is planning, it is culture, and it asks us to reconsider what early America looked like. Not a desperate scramble over glaciers, not a linear descent from the north to the south, but a branching, braided flow, people following rivers, coasts, animals, weather, moving not in waves but in pulses, in choices. The kelp highway theory suggests that the earliest Americans did not merely survive here. They chose the sea, they built a way of life from its rhythms, and even if we cannot recover their voices, their choices are visible in the refuse of their days. The shells they piled, the fish bones they left charred, the fire rings they built at the edge of the tide, these traces may feel small, but they are enough. They are the archaeology of patience, And through that patience a continent opened, slowly, by sea, by paddle, by bare feet pressed into cold sand. We do not yet know how many came this way, or how long they lingered before turning inland. But the evidence suggests that they came early, and they came with purpose. Their story is not told in one place. It is told in the curve of coastlines, in islands long submerged, in tools that do not match the inland record. This is a different kind of origin, and the sea even now remembers, in the shape of its rocks, in the shell beds buried beneath forested cliffs, in the kelp forests that still rise and fall with each tide. It remembers a time when the first people followed its edge, and left behind a quiet trail of salt and flame. That trail did not end with the sea. It turned inland, into a different rhythm, into a landscape carved not by tides, but by fire and stone. In what is now eastern Washington, where the Columbia River bends beneath basalt cliffs, the story shifts. The ocean's voice grows quieter. The rivers begin to speak. But what does it mean to bury your ancestors in volcanic stone? The Columbia Plateau is a land of old eruptions. Lava once spilled across this region in massive flows, hardening into dark shelves of basalt that still define the land. Over time, rivers carved their way through the stone, exposing layers of time in sheer walls and dry canyons. Glacial floods ripped through the terrain during the late Pleistocene, reshaping valleys, leaving behind scablands, coulees, and erratic boulders. The land is dramatic, scarred, ancient, and within this carved landscape people settled, not in large numbers, not in permanent towns, but in family groups that moved with the seasons, people who knew where the fish would gather, where the basalt cliffs sheltered from wind, where obsidian could be found and shaped into tools sharp enough to slice hide or fish with precision. They fished the Columbia. The salmon runs were enormous. Life moved with the river. It fed them. It taught them the seasons. It became more than a source of food. It became a corridor, a memory, a returning promise. And alongside these rivers, they buried their dead. One skeleton, found near the banks of the Columbia in 1996, would ignite decades of debate. Known as the Kennewick Man, this individual was remarkably well preserved. His bones were old, over 8,000 years, and his features at first seemed unfamiliar to modern eyes. Early headlines speculated wildly, but with time and with science, the picture became clearer. Genetic testing revealed his closest living relatives were native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. He was not a mystery. He was a continuity, and his burial place tells us something more. The grave was not deep, but it was deliberate. Stones had been placed around the body, not scattered, arranged. There was care, there was meaning. Burial is not simply disposal, it is memory. It is an acknowledgement of identity. Even when we do not know the language, the pattern speaks. To place the dead in earth is to say that they belonged, to the land, to the people, to the unfolding of time, and in the basalt valleys where the rivers slow just enough to leave behind fertile soil and fish in abundance, we begin to see that belonging, not just in bones, but in how the land was used, in how it was returned to, because this place was not just passed through, it was lived in, it was shaped, and it remembered. The basalt cliffs may have loomed silent above, but the rivers below were alive with sound. In the spring, salmon surged upstream in such numbers that the water itself seemed to shimmer. Birds called from cottonwoods along the banks. Willow branches swayed in the melt-fed wind. The Columbia was more than a river. It was a path carved by water and followed by people. For early humans, rivers were more than landmarks. They were guides. They connected places that could not be seen from any ridge. They cut through vast terrain, allowing for movement, for gathering, for trade. And in Ice Age America, the Columbia and its tributaries became one of the great arteries of life. Obsidian from distant sources appears in sites far from the quarries. Traces of stone from central Oregon show up deep in Washington. Materials moved across hundreds of kilometers, but these were not just raw chunks passed hand to hand. They were shaped, transformed. A black blade made from highland obsidian might have travelled with its owner along the river for years, serving as knife, scraper, or point before being left behind in the ash of a final campfire. Trade was not a market. It was memory. And the rivers carried more than goods. They carried people, ideas, practices. The salmon runs connected communities across time. Even groups who rarely saw each other would know the same fish, the same timing, the same tools, cultural threads woven through the current. This region did not produce the dense settlements of later eras, but it did foster return. Sites along the Columbia Plateau show evidence of reuse. Hearths built in the same place across centuries, bone fragments layered with charcoal then covered with fresh soil, then lit again. Not the signs of year-round occupation, but of rhythm, and that rhythm shaped more than food. It shaped belief. To watch the salmon return year after year is to witness time as a circle. To see the fish rise from the same waters your ancestors fished is to feel that you are part of something ongoing. Burial near rivers may reflect this sense, a way of placing the dead close to the cycles that sustained life, a kind of remembrance that moves with the current. The soil here is layered with flood debris, volcanic ash, wind-blown dust, each layer a page in a book still being written, and somewhere in those layers the bones still rest, quiet, cradled in the rock they once walked upon, and what the bones cannot tell us, the land still whispers, in the direction of rivers, in the shadows of cliffs, in the echo of fish returning with the spring melt. That whisper grows louder when we look at how the dead were treated. Because burial is not just about where a body lies, it is about what the living believe. In the basalt country of the Columbia Plateau, graves are rare, but where they do appear, they are careful. Bodies placed with intention, stones arranged around them, ochre sometimes scattered across the bones. These are not signs of disposal, they are gestures, the kind that come from memory, from meaning, from a quiet reverence for what the land has received. In what is now southeast Washington, the burial of the Kennewick man was not a solitary event. Though his skeleton is one of the most complete, it is part of a broader pattern. Other remains, found along the Snake and Columbia rivers, show similar treatments. And though we do not know the words spoken at those burials, the pattern itself is a form of language, one that speaks across time. Burial in Ice Age America is different from what we find in the Old World. There, the dead were sometimes placed in elaborate tombs, painted caves, carved chambers. But here, the land itself became the tomb, the cliff, the riverbank, the basalt shelf above a fishing camp. These were not marked graves, but they were remembered, passed down by walking, by returning. By knowing the bend in the river where someone had once lain down for the last time. And what do these burials tell us? That identity mattered. That memory was not only held in story, but in soil. To place a body in the earth is to say this person was not only alive, but important, known, grieved. And to do it in a particular place again and again is to anchor that meaning to the land itself. Some sites show signs of repeated use, not cemeteries, but places of presence. A high ridge overlooking a valley, a quiet hollow near a bend in the river, bones placed beneath stones, artifacts tucked beside ribs, the hilt of a tool, a broken blade. These offerings are not loud, but they are intimate. They speak of a relationship not only between people, but between people and place. And it may be that these early acts of burial shaped the way later generations saw the land, not just as resource, but as resting place, as memory, as something that could hold what the living could no longer carry. To walk these river valleys today is to move through a layered space, of water, of stone, of memory pressed into volcanic earth. The rivers of the Pacific Northwest did not just carry fish, they carried story, migration, pattern. For people living among basalt cliffs and wind-carved plateaus, the water was not an obstacle, it was the path itself. From the upper reaches of the Columbia to the confluence of its many tributaries, the river system became a kind of lifeline, not only for salmon, but for people. The same water that shaped the land carved roots into the imagination. You could follow it without getting lost. You could return to it and find your way home. This idea of rivers as corridors is written into the archaeological record. Obsidian sourced from Oregon's volcanic highlands has been found hundreds of kilometers away along the banks of rivers in Idaho and Washington, not as large blocks of stone, but as shaped tools. Blade fragments, scrapers worn from use, these objects did not drift downstream, they were carried, with intention, from one group to another, traded, shared, or lost in the soil after years of work, and so the rivers flowed with more than water. They flowed with movement. Even after death, the river remained. In some burials, we find evidence of bodies placed near stream banks, close enough to hear the water. Perhaps that was the point. A kind of final return, not into silence, but into rhythm. In this landscape, the connection between people and place becomes clearer. Campsites appear not randomly, but where the land offers both shelter and passage. A flat shelf above a river bend, a cluster of stones beside a slow-moving eddy. These were chosen, not only for food, but for story. To fish the same pool your mother once fished is to remember. To watch the salmon move upstream is to see your own life mirrored in motion. The land was not background, it was participant. And then there is the fire. Along these rivers, fire pits speak of return, repeated use, charcoal layered in the soil, not once, but many times. This is not evidence of settlement in the modern sense. It is evidence of placemaking, of presence that returns. These were not permanent villages, but they were permanent memories. To move through the basalt valleys was to carry that memory forward, in the shaping of a tool, in the bend of a path, in the way a fish was cooked or a story was told. The rivers did not just lead the people, they listened to them, carried them, received them, and when they were gone, the rivers remained, still cutting through stone, still carrying ash and bone, still holding the silence left behind. That silence is not absence, it is continuity. Because in this place, where ancient lava cooled into stone, where salmon returned with the seasons, where the dead were laid into earth without monuments, the land itself became the archive. This is not a landscape that calls attention to itself. It does not rise with the grandeur of mountains or echo with the vastness of plains. It hums, it endures, it remembers through stone and erosion, through the slow layering of fire ash and river silt, through the paths people took not once, but over and over. And those paths remain. Archaeologists have traced them in fragments, not trails carved through forest, but lines of presence revealed in firings, in tools shaped from distant obsidian, in bones cracked to release marrow. These are not signs of cities, they are signs of trust, in the land, in the river, in each other, because to return is an act of faith, and people returned here, again and again, not simply because the salmon came, but because meaning had accumulated. The basalt remembered, the cliffs knew, the water still flowed. To bury your dead in a place like this is not to say goodbye, it is to place them in the path of return. That kind of belonging cannot be seen in stone walls. It lives instead in the curve of a valley that always holds sun. In a windbreak remembered from childhood, in the smell of river moss and smoke after rain. The old world gave us towering symbols of belief, altars, painted caves, shrines of bone. But in Ice Age America, belief may have looked like something smaller. A campfire rebuilt in the same hollow, a pile of shellfish cast beside one older than memory, a body buried beneath basalt and left to time. And even now in these places something lingers. The Columbia River still flows through that ancient valley. The cliffs still catch the evening light, and somewhere in the soil, far beneath the feet of hikers and farmers and townspeople, the bones still rest. Kennewick, and others like him, known not by name, but by presence, by choice, by care. They remind us that the first Americans were not just wanderers, they were listeners. They moved through landscapes with attention. They marked places not with stone, but with return. They survived not only by adapting to the land, but by entering into relationship with it. And the land responded. It held them. But what kind of memory keeps a people alive when the land forgets its rivers? In what is now Nevada and Utah, the land tells a different kind of story. A story not of flowing abundance, but of stillness, of waiting, of survival drawn from absence. This is the Great Basin. A vast sweep of high desert valleys, salt flats and folded ranges where water gathers not into rivers, but into vanishing lakes. Here, rainfall has nowhere to run but inward. The land swallows it whole. And in this hollow geography, the silence speaks louder than the wind. This was not an easy place to live, but people lived here. They knew the trick of the desert was not to chase what moved, but to remember what remained, to know where a spring would surface only after the snow melt, to track animals across distances where no trees stood to mark direction, to store food not for days, but for seasons. Survival was not fast, it was slow. Intentional, rooted in the patience of fire. In the dry limestone of what is now Hidden Cave, archaeologists have found bundles of fibre rope, feathered darts, and tightly sealed caches of seeds. Corn had not yet arrived, but wild plants were gathered, processed and stored. Woven baskets were tucked into recesses, stone tools left beside grinding stones, all covered carefully, sealed with dust and time, not discarded, hidden, with purpose. Danger Cave nearby in western Utah offers more. Evidence of human occupation stretching back over 10,000 years, charcoal from ancient hearths, bones of rabbit and antelope, scraps of leather, even human hair, preserved by the cave's dry stillness, a kind of accidental archive, and yet it was never meant to be permanent. These caves were not homes in the usual sense. They were pauses, way stations, shelters from a storm or a cold desert night. What matters is not that people lived there year-round. What matters is that they returned, again and again, to the same places, the same caches, the same fire pits. That rhythm tells us something vital, that in a land where the rivers do not flow to the sea, the people flowed in cycles, following game, gathering roots, watching the sky for signs, listening to the wind for news of rain. Memory became geography. A spring remembered was a map. A cave with food was a promise. This is not a story of conquest. It is a story of carefulness, of fire lit low and sheltered behind stone, of seeds wrapped in fibre and hidden from heat, of walking softly and marking nothing, yet always returning. In the Great Basin, fire was not only for warmth, it was for waiting, it was for preparation, it was placed underground. Across this dry interior of Ice Age America, people built earth ovens, shallow pits lined with heated stones, covered with layers of brush, grasses and earth. In these pits they slow-cooked roots, bulbs, seeds and meat. Not over flame, beneath it, buried in coals and patience, fire beneath the silence. This kind of cooking is not improvisation. It is knowledge, knowing which plants grow bitter unless roasted for hours, knowing how to build a fire that will smoulder for half a day without smoke, knowing how to dig the right soil, to gather the right wood, to wait. And this food was not for now. It was for later. The desert did not allow for convenience. Food arrived in cycles, in pulses, when cattail roots could be harvested, when pine nuts ripened, when jackrabbits moved along seasonal paths. People responded not with pursuit, but with rhythm. They gathered. They cooked. They cached. The earth ovens were not meals. They were plans. Archaeologists have found the charred remains of these ovens beneath dry lake beds and rock shelters. They are rarely dramatic. A ring of blackened soil, a few cracked stones, a layer of carbon beneath sand. But they tell a story as clearly as a painted cave. They tell us that someone was here. Someone knew the season. Someone bent over the ground and shaped fire into nourishment. Someone returned to that same patch of earth, year after year, to repeat the gesture. This is the kind of survival that does not announce itself. It leaves few monuments, but it leaves traces. Fibre bundles hardened by heat, grinding stones polished smooth from years of use, ash mixed with seeds, blown sideways by the desert wind. These are not fragments of desperation. They are tools of continuity, and in this, the Great Basin diverges from the Old World once again. Where Europe's Paleolithic artists carved mammoth ivory and painted red deer on stone, the Americans of the desert practiced something else, a sacred economy of effort, a way of feeding the body that also fed the memory of place. The fire was not just a means, it was a ritual, a way of reminding the land and the people that they still knew each other. And in the Great Basin, this knowing did not take the form of walls or enclosures. It unfolded in open space, in the stillness between ranges, in the sacred emptiness of rock shelters that caught the wind like a whisper. In what is now central Nevada and western Utah, the landscape rises and falls in long, shallow waves. Dry lake beds stretch between jagged ridges. There are no rivers here, only the memory of them. Water appears in springs or seasonal pools, vanishes without warning and reappears in new places. This is a land that forgets unless you remember for it. And so the people remembered. They marked the land not with carvings or shrines, but with return. A rock shelter tucked beneath a cliff became a waypoint. A shallow basin sheltered from wind and morning frost became a winter refuge. These were not temples, but they became sacred through repetition, through use, through the layering of action. Some of these shelters still hold ancient charcoal, bits of bone, dust pressed down by thousands of footsteps. They are not large, often just enough room for a family, a bundle of possessions, a few wrapped foods. But in these confined spaces the outside world was remembered, discussed, translated. The Great Basin does not offer spectacle. It offers attention. To dwell here is to notice the colour of stone at noon, the echo of a raven calling from the canyon wall, the way light stretches across the salt flats just before dusk. These details were not decoration, they were direction, and it may be that in this sparseness people found something deeper than survival, a kind of reflection, a way of seeing themselves in the land, not as owners, but as visitors, as custodians of a memory too old to name. In this way, the rock shelter became more than a place to rest. It became a threshold, a place between outside and inside, between wild and held, between memory and breath. Even today, when archaeologists enter these spaces, there is a hush, a feeling, not of emptiness, but of presence, because the land still remembers the people who once moved through it, slowly, intentionally, carving no roads, building no walls, but leaving behind layers of silence that speak with every gust of desert wind. That silence was never empty. It was mapped in memory. In a region where rainfall could vanish for years, where rivers ended in dust, where no forest marked the passing of time, survival meant turning the entire desert into a web of remembered places, a geography of return. Of sites too subtle for strangers to notice, but too important for the people to forget. Caching was not a convenience, it was a lifeway. A woven basket filled with seeds or dried meat, placed in a crevice, sealed with grass and stone and marked only in memory. These were promises to the future, gifts from the present to the self who would return hungry, sometimes months later, sometimes years. In the dry air of the Great Basin, some of these caches endured. Archaeologists have found them intact, baskets tucked behind stones, seeds still inside, pine nuts, goosefoot, bulrush root, not randomly stored but selected, cleaned, preserved. Protected. To cache something in a land like this is to say that place matters, that memory is reliable, that others, your children, your companions, your future self, will walk this way again. This web of sites stretched across what are now state lines and county borders. But to the people, there were no such divisions, only landmarks. A boulder cracked in half, a patch of moss that stays green after the first frost, a spring that bubbles up from beneath volcanic gravel. These were the signposts, and so travel through the basin was not a journey into unknown wilderness. It was a conversation with known places, with stone, with wind. With the memory of the last time a fire was built in that exact spot. Tools moved along these paths. So did songs. So did stories. Obsidian points, sourced from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, have been found in the central valleys of Nevada. The people who carried them did not always stay, but they paused. They left something behind, a flake, a fire, a reminder, and sometimes they left nothing visible, only knowledge, the kind passed in gesture and whisper, the kind that says wait here or dig here or this place matters without ever speaking aloud. The desert requires that kind of communication. It does not forgive carelessness. It rewards precision. It rewards return. And in that return, even the most temporary of camps becomes part of the sacred map. Not through writing, but through repetition, through touch, through walking the same path again, in a world where the water hides and the wind forgets. In a world where the water hides and the wind forgets, presence becomes the only lasting thing. Not the kind of presence marked by buildings or stone carvings, but the quieter kind, the kind left in the feeling of a canyon that once held firelight, in the path your feet know without thinking, in the return to a spring that still flows where it always did. The emptiness of the Great Basin is not true emptiness. It is filled with things that endure only through attention, and that attention became a way of life, a way of being with the land instead of on it. In this wide and open desert, there are places that feel different, rock shelters that echo differently, cliffs that face the rising sun just so, dry lake beds where artifacts have clustered over generations without anyone building a home. These were not random campsites. They were thresholds, places where people paused, rested, waited, watched. Not always because of what the land offered, but because of what it remembered. Spirituality in the Great Basin may not have looked like carved icons or ritual monuments. It may have looked like silence, like listening, like walking a trail at dawn and knowing that 5 generations ago someone stopped at the same place to cook a meal or bury a bundle or sit quietly with the wind. And even in the archaeological record, the stillness holds clues. Some shelters contain buried offerings, small things, a few tools placed beneath stones, a bundle of ash wrapped in bark. Once thought to be refuse, now understood as intentional, a practice not of discarding, but of giving, of placing something back into the earth. This relationship between people and the land was not extractive. It was reciprocal. The land was not just a backdrop for human survival. It was a presence to be respected, a source of knowledge, a partner in time. In the Old World, great caves were painted with scenes of hunt and spirit. In Ice Age America, the canvas was different. It was the desert floor, the sound of walking, the heat that rose from earth ovens, the glow of embers in a shelter with no door. And though the Great Basin offers few grand ruins, it offers something older. A geography of memory that lives only through return, through the invisible maps carried in the mind. Through the quiet understanding that a spring is sacred not because of its appearance, but because it is known. To survive here was to slow down, to feel, to notice. And perhaps in that act of noticing, the sacred was not something added to the land, it was simply revealed. What happens when the land itself begins to move? In what is now Kansas and Nebraska, where cornfields stretch into horizon now, the Ice Age shaped a different world. It was a world of giants, of ancient winds, of motion. This was the Mammoth Steppe, a treeless plain that once swept from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. It was colder then. Drier, too. But it was not barren. Thick grasses fed herds in numbers we can barely imagine. Mammoths, bison, horses, camels, elk, even lions once stalked this American grass. This was not prairie as we know it. This was a biome of movement, and to live here meant joining the rhythm of chase, and that rhythm made demands. Because what does it take to kill a mammoth with a handmade blade? It takes more than strength. It takes planning, coordination. Tools shaped not just from stone, but from the minds of people who studied patterns, who knew the curve of the wind, who waited days for a herd to cross a ravine, who placed a spear in the path of something 5 times their size. The archaeological record begins to speak in this place. Around 13,000 years ago, across what is now the Great Plains, we begin to find a signature, a fluted stone point sharp and delicate, the Clovis point. It appears suddenly, from Texas to the Dakotas, from Arizona to Nova Scotia. Its distribution is wide, its design is precise, thin, fluted, and deadly. Likely hafted onto wooden shafts, these blades could pierce hide, bone, organ. But the point alone is not the story. The story is in the kill sites, in eastern Colorado, at a place now called Dent. Mammoth bones lie in a pattern that suggests intention, not scavenging, not chance, but trap, spear, sequence. Beneath a layer of silt and time, broken tusks mingle with the tools that likely brought them down. And at the Folsom site in New Mexico, discovered in the 1920s, similar bones, but this time bison, revealed that humans had hunted here long before anyone believed possible. These discoveries shifted the map of American history. Clovis was once called the first culture of the Americas, the beginning, the origin point. But newer findings have pushed the story further back. Clovis, it seems, was not the first. But it may have been a climax. a sharpening of knowledge passed down across generations of hunters who followed the herds across a moving world, and the land shaped that knowledge. The open grass gave nowhere to hide. The hunt was not about ambush, it was about understanding. In what is now western Oklahoma, Montana, and Alberta, the shape of the land became the strategy. The cliffs, the coulees, the hidden ridgelines. These were not just part of the scenery, they were part of the plan. Because in a world of massive herds, the greatest tool was not the spear, it was the stampede. Bison jumps are among the most powerful archaeological signatures left from the Ice Age plains. They are places where entire groups of animals were driven over cliffs, panicked, herded, chased, and then butchered below. This was not random violence. It was skill, timing, unity. To organise such a hunt required more than hunger. It required language. Not necessarily spoken in the way we know it now, but shared. In gesture, in signal, in expectation. One group would wait in the grasses, another would move behind the herd, slowly, carefully. Then, with noise, with fire, with cries, with waving arms, they would turn the animals. The cliff would rise unseen, the fall would come fast, and below the work began. At sites like Head Smashed in Alberta, the evidence lies deep in layers, bones upon bones, separated by centuries, marked with tool cuts, crushed by stone. This was not a one-time act. This was tradition, return, a place of survival that became, in time, a place of memory. Not every landscape allowed such coordination, but the plains did. The wide openness forced people to think together, to act as one, to know not just the behaviour of prey, but the behaviour of each other, and sometimes the targets were even larger than bison. The mammoth was not driven over cliffs. It was too watchful, too rare, too large, but it could be isolated, injured, drawn into mud. Some Clovis kill sites show patterns that suggest the mammoth was brought down not by one spear, but by many. Some from below, some from behind. Not chaos or accident, but a shared understanding of danger and necessity. And what happened after the kill may have been just as important. The butchering was methodical. Tools were sharpened. Bones were split. Meat was dried or roasted. Fat was rendered. Organs, prized for nutrients, were not wasted. The kill became a site of learning, of story, of gathering. In this, the plains gave not just food, it gave cohesion, roles, practice, belonging. And the places where these events occurred were not forgotten. People returned to hunt, to remember, to teach the next generation where the cliff begins, where the wind shifts, where the mammoth once fell. For a long time, those places were thought to be the beginning, Clovis. The word has become a symbol, a shorthand for firstness, for origin, for the moment when humans truly arrived in the Americas. The Clovis toolkit, with its distinct fluted points, shaped by skilled hands and fine percussion, appeared across the continent in what seemed like a sudden burst of innovation. Thin stone blades, bone tools, ivory rods. These artifacts appear together in layers dated to around 13,000 years ago, widespread, precise, elegant, and for decades, Clovis was considered the first. But the land began to disagree. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Page-Latson in Florida, Buttermilk Creek in Texas. These places scattered across the Americas began whispering something older. Bones, tools, charcoal. Human presence dated to 15,000 years ago, or more. Each site a quiet contradiction, together a chorus. And so Clovis shifted, from first to something else. Perhaps Clovis was not an arrival, but a refinement. The flowering of knowledge carried down through generations of earlier Americans. A convergence of stone, story, and necessity. A style that spread because it worked, because the land asked for it, because the herds demanded it. The Great Plains, with their openness and their herds, were the perfect canvas for this strategy. And still, Clovis feels like a beginning. Not because it was the first, but because it is where the story crystallizes, where the tools become recognizable, where the land and the people seem to be in step. The myth of the first Americans may have grown from this sense of clarity, a single culture, a single point in time. But Ice Age America does not offer such simplicity. The bones tell us there were many. The tools show variation. The footprints, like those found at White Sands in New Mexico, tell us that people walked these lands long before Clovis ever flaked its first blade. And in this, the plains remind us of something older than culture. They remind us of movement, of following, of watching the land and adjusting. Clovis points may endure in the soil. But the knowledge that shaped them came from the herds, from the wind, from the open grass that asked nothing and offered everything, if you were willing to move with it. But in time, the herds began to vanish. The mammoths were the first to go, then the giant sloths, then the camels, the short-faced bears, the towering bison. One by one, the giants of Ice Age America disappeared from the land that had shaped them, and the question remains, did we do it? The overkill theory says yes, that humans, armed with handmade blades and sharpened cooperation, arrived with the precision of predators, that the Clovis point was more than a hunting tool. It was a tipping point, a turning. There is evidence. Bones split for marrow, spears embedded in ribs, stone flakes scattered among tusks, patterns of dismemberment that show knowledge, not chaos, not waste, but experience, the careful method of people who understood anatomy, who knew where to strike, how to cut, what to take, and what to leave behind. Yet most bones lie clean, no cuts, no tools, no proof, and the world was warming. As the Ice Age ended, the Great Steppe transformed. Grasslands gave way to trees, lakes dried, rivers changed course, migration routes narrowed, the herds found less to eat. Calves weakened. Drought came more often. The land that had once offered everything began to change its terms, and the people changed with it. So what ended the giants? Was it the blade, or the sun? Was it us? Or was it time? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps extinction is not a single blow, but a series of quiet imbalances that build across years. Perhaps we were only the last weight added to a fragile scale. At a site near the border of Kansas and Colorado, Canorado they call it, 2 mammoths were found, one adult, one juvenile, their bones marked with careful butchering, stone tools nearby, charcoal pressed into the earth, not a massacre, a meal, a moment. A need, no sign of waste, no frenzy, just intention, precision, respect. It may not have been destruction, it may have been survival, because to kill something so large is to change the story. Even once, even carefully. You feed your family, you reshape the landscape, you learn how to do it again. The kill becomes part of memory. The knowledge passes on, a technique, a path, a lesson, and still the plains remember. The winds cross empty grass now where mammoths once moved in shadow and breath. The Clovis blades remain in the soil, sharp, silent, waiting. But they're waiting in a world that no longer moves with thunder. The giants are gone. And what remains is us. After the mammoths, the steppe changed, not just in biology but in meaning. The grass still grew, but it did not tremble under herds of bone and breath. The sky still opened wide, but the silhouettes beneath it were smaller, more careful, more human, and the humans adapted. Hunting changed. Bison remained, but they too would shrink in size. Traps became more intricate. Spears were joined by atlatls, and eventually bows. The people no longer followed herds across hundreds of miles. Instead, they circled within tighter ranges, revisiting waterholes, building memory into the soil, staying longer, watching more. The sites they left behind grew more complex. Hearths layered with charcoal, tools sharpened with knowledge passed hand to hand, broken bones packed into middens that marked not just waste, but continuity. The rhythm of life slowed. It became seasonal, predictable, and yet somehow even more fragile. The people who walked these plains after the giants did not live in their shadow. They lived in their absence, and in that absence new ways of belonging emerged. Across what is now Nebraska and the Dakotas, caches of tools have been found, wrapped carefully, sealed with clay, left beneath stones, not discarded, preserved, perhaps for trade. Perhaps for the future. In these small acts of storage we see a shift, a quiet promise, the idea that someone would return. In what is now eastern Colorado we find sites not just of hunting, but of gathering, goosefoot, bulrush, wild grains. The landscape was no longer just a place to chase, it became a place to tend, a place to know deeply. The wind still moved, but the people began to wait for it, to listen to its direction, to let the grass speak, and still, in some places, the memory of the giants lingered. The bones were not always removed, some were left in place, and later, when people passed, they paused, they placed ochre. They left tools, they sat, not to hunt, but to remember, because even without writing, the land could hold a story, a wide valley, a scattering of ribs, a line of stones placed where once a mammoth had fallen. These became landmarks of memory, not myth, but presence, a kind of map that only the feet could read. And so the plains, stripped of their great beasts, remained full of meaning, not emptiness, not aftermath, but transformation. East of that silence, the land changed once more. In what is now Ohio, Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania, the great flat openness folded inward. The air grew heavy with moisture. Pines and maples pressed close. Rivers braided themselves through stone. And into this green hush came people carrying memory and questions and the beginnings of something else. The forest did not move like the steppe. It pulsed, it circled, it resisted distance. Here, survival meant rhythm, a different kind of map. One built not on herds, but on seasons, not on endless sightlines, but on trails worn through leaf and bark and root. And here we begin to find the dead. What does it mean when people bury their children with red ochre? The question echoes in the soil. At sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, nestled beneath a sandstone overhang in what is now Pennsylvania, archaeologists have uncovered layers that stretch deep into time. Charcoal flecks from ancient fires, broken blades, seeds, scraps of woven fibre. The radiocarbon dates reach back past Clovis, perhaps 16,000 years, perhaps more. People camped here again and again, not just for shelter, for return. Far to the south, along the banks of the Savannah River, the Topper site offers something even older. Crude tools, chipped stone, beneath the Clovis horizon, beneath what should have been the start of the story. Some accept it, some resist, but the stone remains, weathered. Silent, placed. And among these scattered signs of presence we find ceremony. In shallow graves or tucked into dry cave floors, we begin to see the early marks of meaning. Beads carved from river shells, red ochre scattered over bones, small tools placed with care beside ribs and spines, and most haunting of all, the bones of children, marked with pigment, wrapped and buried. This is not accident. This is intention. And though we cannot know what they believed, we know they believed something, because red ochre is not useful. It is symbolic. It does not feed, it does not warm, but it speaks. In every corner of Ice Age America where it is found, it says the same thing. Someone was here. Someone mattered. Someone was remembered. The eastern woodlands do not give up their stories easily, but in pigment and ash, in fibre and flint, a voice begins to rise. Not loud, not clear, but insistent. In this part of Ice Age America, survival was not a sprint after prey. It was a circle, a return, a rhythm that followed the land as it changed with the light. Here the calendar was written in leaf and stream. Spring opened the forest like a hand. Shoots pushed through the thawing soil. Wild onions, fiddleheads. Tender greens that would not last long. The people gathered them quickly, moved lightly, watched the clouds. By summer, the rivers grew full. Shad ran upstream. Eels twisted through shallows. Fishing became a daily ritual. Hooks carved from bone. Nets woven from fibres stripped from milkweed or dogbane. Fish roasted on flat stones. Bones picked clean and tossed into the fire. When the berries ripened, the people moved again. Blueberries, raspberries, wild grapes. The forest gave in bursts, not in vast herds, but in scattered offerings, and the people moved through it carefully, remembering which hills ripened first, which paths led to fruit. Which clearings held deer tracks. Autumn brought the nuts, hickory, walnut, beech, acorn. They gathered them by the basketful, cracked them open with hammerstones, boiled them into pastes, stored them in bark-lined pits near their camps. These were not just snacks. They were winter. Survival hidden in shells. Deer hunting peaked with the falling leaves. Silent tracking through leaf litter. Spears readied. Sometimes traps. Sometimes snares. Always patience. The forest did not offer everything in one place. It offered one thing at a time, and the people learned to move with that offering. Not fast, not far, but with attention. And still, they returned to certain spots. Rock shelters near rivers, low ridges above floodplains, sandy clearings where the soil stayed dry. These places became familiar. Campsites, sorting grounds, story grounds. People would pass through again and again, sometimes leaving tools, sometimes a hearth, sometimes a body. Season after season, the forest taught its own kind of memory. And in return, the people left behind rhythms. Firings layered in charcoal, post holes pressed into the clay, nutshells scattered where hands once cracked them open, and sometimes a bit of ochre still clinging to a flake of bone. The forest was not only a place to feed the body, it became a canvas for meaning, a quiet space where thought turned into gesture, gesture into pattern, pattern into belief. In what is now Florida, a site called Windover holds one of the oldest cemeteries in the Western Hemisphere. Bodies buried in a pond, carefully wrapped, heads facing west, many of them children. Dozens still retain traces of red ochre, brushed or poured across their skulls. The pigment pooled in the peat, clinging for millennia to bone, fibre and hair. Why? Why take the time to gather ochre from distant sources, to grind it, to carry it, to use it not in art, but in farewell? Perhaps the answer lies in something deeper than language, in colour, in blood, in memory. Ochre was not limited to Windover. It appears at burial sites across the eastern woodlands, in New York, in Kentucky, in Alabama. It is rarely alone. It travels with tools, with beads carved from shell, with blades placed near the hands, sometimes with nothing at all, just a dusting of red near the chest. And these choices were made by people who had no books, no cities, no gods we can name, but they had ceremony, they had repetition, they had places they returned to when the body stilled. The forest, thick with sound and green with life, became a space for silence, for reflection, for parting. At some sites, ochre is found in places where no bones remain, just pigment in the soil, a hearth nearby, a scatter of flakes, as if the act of marking the land was enough, as if memory could be placed into the ground itself. The earliest forms of art in the eastern woodlands are not painted caves or carved stone. They are arrangements, offerings, placements of meaning, a blade shaped more finely than function demands, a bead drilled with care, a bone tool decorated with lines that serve no practical use, and once placed, these items were left behind, not as trash, but as signal. The people who moved through this forest were not only hunters and gatherers, they were observers, interpreters, their lives threaded through light and leaf and memory, and their presence is written not in sentences but in layers, charcoal, shell, pigment, pattern. These were not just remnants of survival, they were signs of something else beginning, a shift in how humans related to the land, to time and to each other. Because what happens when people begin to return to the same place? In what is now Kentucky and southern Ohio, deep within the valleys where rivers bend and floodplains settle, archaeologists have found sites with hearths layered one atop the next, not for a season, not even for a single lifetime, but across generations, ash buried in ash, each fire a memory, each ring a return. The forest invited it. It rewarded familiarity, a certain hill for hickory, a bend in the river for mussels, a clearing where deer always passed at dawn. These patterns did not need to be marked. They were remembered, stored in footsteps, shared in quiet gestures, taught without needing to be said. And the places themselves began to gather meaning. A rock overhang where ochre was ground again and again, a spring where tools were washed, a patch of soil where berries were always first to ripen. These places became more than useful. They became sacred, not sacred in the way of temples, sacred in the way of repetition, of presence, of return. In what is now Alabama, a riverside site shows signs of ritual not in monuments, but in middens, shell heaps, layered and organized, not discarded at random, shaped, piled with rhythm, perhaps as markers, perhaps as offerings, perhaps as memory anchors to say, we were here, we are still here. And this is what begins to emerge in the eastern woodlands, a new kind of settlement, not cities, not farms, but clusters of presence, tied together not by walls but by paths, and each path a thread of meaning. These early Americans did not live in isolation. They gathered, seasonally, purposefully, at places where rivers narrowed or where nut groves clustered. They met, shared stories, exchanged blades for shell, shared food, perhaps news, perhaps names. Then they moved again. But the gathering left a mark, and each return deepened it. Over time, these places may have held stories. This is where we met the others. This is where we buried the twins. This is where the deer stood still and waited. The forest was thick, but it did not blur their world. It framed it, gave it shape, and in that shape memory settled like moss, slowly, softly, until the place itself carried the story. In what is now Tennessee and the Carolinas, traces of these stories remain. Shallow depressions where posts once stood, fire-cracked rock scattered in rings, fragments of blades, worn not from use but from time, and always, somewhere in the soil, a line of ochre that does not belong. These are not the ruins of cities, they are the fingerprints of return. The people of the eastern woodlands did not live fixed in one place, but they also did not wander without memory. Their movement was not a drifting, it was a pattern, a pulse, and through that rhythm something new emerged, a relationship with place that was not only practical but emotional. What does it mean to return to the same grove each spring? To find the same tree blooming, the same path still clear, the same stone still warm in the afternoon light? These returns shaped identity. Over time, people were no longer just surviving, they were belonging, and from that belonging came meaning. We see it in the graves, in the pigments, in the placement of tools beside the bones, in the careful wrapping of bodies, in the way some were buried with their faces turned toward a certain direction. Not randomly, but always the same. We see it in the fire rings, reused again and again, in the food remained sorted and burned in patterns that suggest story. Not waste, but order. And we see it in the ochre, always the ochre. Why does it appear again and again? Across thousands of years, across hundreds of miles, in caves and riverside clearings, with adults, with infants, with no one at all. Perhaps it was the colour of blood, of life, of something returned to the earth. Perhaps it marked transition, perhaps it marked memory. We do not know what they believed, but we know they believed something. And when the glaciers finally pulled back, and the great beasts vanished, and the landscape warmed and softened, the people of the forest stayed. They did not follow the mammoths, they followed something older, the land beneath their feet. They carried with them not just blades and baskets, but memory, the knowledge of where to walk, when to stop, what to bury, and how to come back. And through that long remembering they shaped a world of pines and pigment and ritual, a world we can still feel, in the stillness of forest soil, in the red smear beneath a child's rib, in the echo of footsteps pressed into clay. In that echo, the story of the eastern woodlands softened into memory, and far to the south, beneath a slower sun and skies swollen with humidity, that memory pooled in water. In what is now central Florida, near the quiet sprawl of modern Titusville, an ancient pond once mirrored the sky without ripple or noise. Hidden among cattails and the reaching arms of cypress trees, its stillness stretched deep into the soil. This was not a place of spectacle or story. It was a place of return, a place of leaving, and for more than 7,000 years the Windover pond held the dead. When construction workers first unearthed bones in the early 1980s, they did not expect them to speak. But the peat had done something remarkable. It had preserved not only skeletons, but minds. Inside more than 90 skulls, brain tissue had survived. Not as symbols, not as myths, but as organic memory, protected by water and sealed in time. What emerged was not a burial ground of warriors or chiefs. It was a resting place for a people who moved through the wetlands with quiet knowledge and enduring care. Men and women, children and elders, each one laid gently into the pond, wrapped in woven mats and positioned with heads to the west. The Windover dead were not alone in the water. Alongside them were sharpened wooden stakes pressed into the soft earth near the skulls. These were not weapons, they were markers, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps practical, but always deliberate. Grave goods were sparse but meaningful. Shells, stone tools, pigments and fibres, each chosen with intention. Some burials held no items at all. Others offered a glimpse into the mind of a living person who had paused by the edge of the pond and placed something beside the body, knowing it would never be seen again. The fabric wrappings remain among the oldest textiles ever found in the Americas. Woven from plant fibres using skill that suggests deep practice, they represent not only utility, but tenderness. This was not the work of survival alone, it was ritual, a language of threads and water. The peat preserved their weave, their shape, their softness, even their purpose. In every bundle there is a gesture, a decision, an act of return. What kind of people come back to the same watery grave for more than 1,000 years? What kind of relationship with place must exist for the dead to be trusted to the earth in this way, again and again for centuries? There were no monuments, no cave paintings, no carved bones or towering stones, only silence, only stillness, and the presence of a people who remembered. The pond did not preserve everything, but what it kept was precise. Windover is one of the rare sites in all of Ice Age America where organic material survived, not fossilized, not petrified, but soft, fibrous, vulnerable, and real. The waterlogged soil, rich in tannins and devoid of oxygen, acted as both blanket and seal. It held back decay. It allowed time to pause, and in that pause we find clarity. Cordage remains, twisted from native plants. Some of it still knotted, some looped through beads or wrapped around bone. These are not guesses, these are artifacts. They show technique, they show repetition, and they show care. The wood too was preserved. Slats and stakes carved by hand, shaped with stone tools, sometimes pointed, sometimes not. These were placed vertically near the skulls, perhaps to secure wrappings or mark the individual's resting spot. Each was measured to the body it stood beside. This was not ritual for spectacle, it was private, measured, repeated. Even fragments of clothing survived, mats woven from split rushes, fibres pressed and smoothed into sheets. In some graves the dead were wrapped more than once, layered as if for warmth. The weaves vary, which suggests that textile work was not a centralised task but personal, passed through generations, probably along lines of kinship. Every strand tied by a hand that had done it before. And then there is the DNA. Windover gave us not only the shapes of bones, but the codes within them. The mitochondrial DNA preserved in the skulls offered something no pigment or tool could. Genetic memory. Traces of lineage. Maternal lines still echoing through descendants today. Analysis suggests they were not recent migrants. These were people who had lived on the continent for a long time, perhaps since the earliest movements out of Beringia. Perhaps longer than we have yet learned to measure. Their genetic profile does not match all expectations. It complicates the narrative. It reminds us that Ice Age America was not a single wave of migration or a single story of arrival. It was layered, multiple, regional, full of crossings and waitings and returns. At Windover, we begin to feel that reality, not in abstract data, but in things once touched. A child buried with a bone pin still threaded through fabric, a woman with a turtle shell bowl placed near her side, a man whose skull was cracked in life, then healed, then buried with a sharpened antler tine. These are stories too quiet for words, but too deliberate to forget. The people who returned to Windover year after year did not arrive from elsewhere. They rose from the land itself. They belonged to the rhythm of a world that no longer exists, a Florida before the coast had swallowed their final shape, when the peninsula was wider, drier, and edged with open savannas and freshwater marshes that moved like slow breathing across the earth. Theirs was not a life built on cities or herds, it was a life arranged around wetlands. Not a single home, but many. Temporary camps scattered along riverbanks, springs and tree islands, and each one known, remembered, used with care. They hunted white-tailed deer with spears tipped in bone. They trapped turtles. They gathered freshwater mussels, cracked open with stones and roasted near the fire. They wove baskets to carry tubers, berries, and roots. They worked with the materials that lasted: palmetto fronds, cordgrass, pine resin. Nothing wasted, everything seasonal. The diet revealed at Windover is astonishing not for its exotic content, but for its intimacy with the landscape. Plants now rare or obscure appear in their stomach contents, their teeth, their baskets: groundnut, smilax, greenbrier, bulrush. All gathered in quantities that suggest deep knowledge passed down through generations. This was not guessing, it was remembering. Their camps moved with the water. During the dry season they settled near the pond, fished the shrinking creeks, and dug deep into the roots of the forest for starch and fibre. In the wet season, when storms pressed the rivers outward and the mosquitoes rose like smoke from the swamps, they moved inland, following game and seeking higher ground. But they always came back. That return was not just practical, it was sacred. Windover was not the only pond, but it was the one they chose again and again for the dead. That means something. That kind of return creates gravity. A place becomes more than useful. It becomes meaningful. It becomes sacred. No great mounds, no walls, no carvings, just the echo of footsteps in soft soil. The sound of water folding back over what was placed within it. A memory without a name, but full of weight. Even now, to stand at the Windover site, which today lies beneath a stretch of sand and roadside fence, is to feel that stillness pressing against the edge of knowing. The people are gone, their mats are folded, their DNA catalogued, but the air does not forget, and neither does the soil. In the stillness of Windover, a different kind of record endures, not just of how these people lived, but how they responded when life broke open. Wounds do not lie, and neither do bones. So what can trauma, healing, and burial reveal about the emotional architecture of ancient life? Some of the Windover dead were buried with visible signs of pain. Fractures that had healed imperfectly, injuries to skulls that had knitted back together over time, joint degeneration in knees and spines. One woman had a broken forearm that had fused while misaligned, forcing her wrist inward for what was likely years before her death. But someone must have cared for her during that time. Someone must have carried water, shared food, waited as she rested, and perhaps even held her hand while she slept. The traces of care are subtle, but unmistakable. A child's body buried with a sharpened bone point placed just beside the left hand, not as a weapon, but perhaps as a promise. Several older adults were laid to rest with food offerings tucked near the ribs, freshwater mussel shells and preserved plant matter. These were not gestures of power or wealth, they were acts of intimacy. They suggest that vulnerability was not feared or hidden, it was carried. And though we cannot know what names they used for grief or love, the consistency of the burials, the direction of the heads, the wrapping of bodies, the gentle inclusion of pigments and items, tells us that loss had a shape, it had a form, it had rituals that were remembered across many generations. There is evidence of childhood illness too. Bone growth lines interrupted by fevers, malnourishment during dry years. Some children did not live long past infancy, yet their burials are among the most careful. One infant was found wrapped in several layers of matting, head cradled in a curve of wood, with red ochre sprinkled around the crown. Why treat the death of someone so young with such intention? What did they believe happened after breath stopped? We cannot say. But we can see that their response to loss was not to retreat. It was to gather, to remember, to prepare the body for something larger than its silence. Windover is not a site of conquest or dominance. It is a site of endurance, a place where pain was not erased, but laid gently beneath the water. A place where love was threaded into fibres and folded around the dead. That love remains. Not in the fabric, which has long since dried and curled, but in the pattern, in the way things were placed, in the way the same acts were repeated again and again, across centuries, and in the quiet persistence of the place itself. Windover is not loud. It is not monumental. It does not rise like a temple or shine like gold. But it stays. The pond is shallow, but the memory it holds is deep. It tells us that a people once knew this place so intimately that they returned to it across generations, not to take, but to give something back. That kind of consistency does not emerge from necessity alone. It comes from a long relationship, from belonging, from knowing a place not just by its usefulness, but by its silence, by its ability to hold what matters most. Even now, the site has more to teach. Its preservation has allowed scientists to see patterns that would have otherwise been lost. Through DNA, we see threads of maternal lineage that connect individuals buried generations apart. Through the plant fibres, we see signs of regional adaptation, techniques passed from hand to hand without ever being written. Through the placement of bodies and the presence of ochre, we see the outlines of a belief system that valued return over departure, presence over legacy. And yet there is a fragility to it all. The peat that preserved these lives is vulnerable. When exposed to air, it begins to dry and flake. Some of the best preserved textiles began to decay within days of excavation. The bodies were never meant to be seen again. The water was their guardian, and once opened, the pond could not be resealed. This raises a question. What does it mean to study a culture whose most sacred act was to place the dead out of reach? We must look with humility. We must accept that some things cannot be fully known. Windover does not give us answers so much as it asks us to listen, to slow down, to stand near the edge of something ancient and not move too quickly away. The people who buried their kin here were not forgotten. Their names may be gone, their language lost, but their choices remain. The lines they carved, the way they wrapped their dead, the direction of the heads, the pigments, the care. It is all still here, held not just in soil but in silence. Windover is not the only sacred site in Ice Age America, but it is one of the clearest windows we have into the emotional world of a people who understood how to live with the land and how to leave it gently when the time came. The people who buried their dead beneath the Florida wetlands lived in a world still shaped by glacial memory, but not all journeys paused there. Some continued, south, always farther south, past forests and plains, past the mountains, until the land itself began to vanish into fog and tide. What kind of journey ends where the continent runs out of breath? In what is now southern Chile, beyond the Andes and the edge of Patagonia, a quiet site lay buried beneath a blanket of peat and river silt. For many years the field seemed unremarkable, flat, damp, full of sedge and broken tree trunks. Then in the 1970s a group of scientists began to dig. What they found would shake the foundations of how we understand the human story in the Americas. Monte Verde. Not a campsite, not a single fire pit or scattering of tools, but a village, an arrangement of structures, footprints, hearths, wooden stakes still driven into the ground, surrounded by scraps of hide and remnants of rope. And around these were remains of food, berries, plants, shellfish, chunks of mastodon meat, and strips of seaweed that had been carried over 20 miles from the coast. This was not temporary. This was a home. And yet the radiocarbon dates pulled from the layers returned a timeline no one expected. Nearly 14,500 years ago, possibly more. That is long before the inland ice-free corridor was open, long before the Clovis hunters of the Great Plains left their fluted points behind. How had people reached the southern tip of the Americas so early? The continent stretches more than 10,000 miles from Alaska to Patagonia. Even with favourable weather, rivers to follow, and animals to hunt, such a journey would require generations. No one walks that far without knowing where to stop. No one settles in southern Chile by accident. The evidence suggests they followed the sea. Unlike the interior routes, the Pacific coastline offered a different kind of passage, a marine highway lined with kelp forests, tidal flats and sea caves. The resources were plentiful. Fish, sea mammals, shellfish, edible plants. The ocean did not need to be tilled. It could be read. It could be remembered. And perhaps that memory stretched southward from Beringia, carried in stories, in wayfinding skills, in hands that knew how to mend nets and shape boats from bark. But Monte Verde is not only important because of its age, it is important because it suggests stability. These were not people just passing through. The preserved structures, laid out with deliberate spacing and framed by logs and ropes, point to a pattern, to a plan, to a group that had lived and returned and built again. The people who lived at Monte Verde knew the land in ways that left no need for monuments. What they left behind was quieter, bundles of plants tied with string. Hearths still blackened with charcoal, a child's footprint pressed into clay, a chewed leaf still holding the imprint of teeth. These were not signs of exploration, they were signs of presence. The shelter posts were driven deep into the ground, arranged to support hide-covered frames stretched against the wind. Inside the structures, traces of medicinal plants were found. Some were chewed, some boiled. Others had been laid carefully near sleeping areas, suggesting not just knowledge but care. This was not a world of stone tools and spear points alone. It was a world of firelight and herbs, of healing, of observation. Food remains tell a story of remarkable adaptation. The people of Monte Verde did not rely on mammoth hunts or massive kills. They gathered what the coast gave them: shellfish, wild potatoes, nuts, seaweed, and small game. They dried meat from now extinct species, including paleolama and gomphothère. They brought in seafood from the Pacific and root vegetables from the forest margins. Their meals were local, yet diverse. This was not desperation. It was abundance, managed wisely. The preservation of seaweed at the site is among the most striking finds. 9 distinct species have been identified, carried over long distances from the coast. Some were edible, others may have been used for medicine or wrapping. That seaweed could survive this long is due to the same peat-rich soil that held the bones and wood. But its presence also suggests something more: intention. These people knew how to transport perishable items across miles. That knowledge alone implies a system of movement and storage far beyond the immediate site. Even the layout of Monte Verde speaks to a pattern. Structures were grouped loosely, with activity areas spread between them. Hearths were not isolated, but repeated, suggesting families or clusters within the group. There are no signs of hierarchy. No grand burial, no central monument. What we see is a community that functioned through shared space and repeated action. Shelter, cooking, gathering, tending, weaving. All of it laid quietly into the earth, preserved not through effort but through accident and time. Monte Verde's survival is fragile. The same water that kept it whole can also take it back. But for now, we have a glimpse into something nearly impossible. A settled human presence at the end of the world long before most thought it possible. And with that glimpse, everything changed. Before Monte Verde, the dominant model of migration into the Americas was built around a single culture: Clovis. Defined by its distinctive spear points, Clovis was once thought to represent the first Americans. Their tools appear in the Great Plains, in hunting sites, in mammoth kill zones scattered across North America. And for decades their arrival, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, shaped the entire story. But Monte Verde is older. That simple fact rewrote the narrative, because if people lived at the southern tip of the continent more than 14,000 years ago, then they must have arrived long before the Clovis culture ever emerged. The story of Ice Age America was no longer a single migration wave. It became layered, multiple, filled with pauses and pulses. There had to have been people already exploring, already settling, already weaving fibre and collecting seaweed, while the glaciers still covered parts of the north. The archaeological community resisted at first. The dates were too early, the evidence too strange. But the preservation was undeniable. The radiocarbon results were verified by multiple labs. The materials matched the landscape. The layout fit no known forgers. Monte Verde was not a hoax. It was simply unexpected. And so, a quiet shift began. Clovis did not vanish, but it lost its exclusivity. Researchers began to look again at earlier layers in old sites, and to test new areas where clues might have been overlooked. A new model emerged, one of coastal migration, a maritime path that skirted the edge of the continent, offering resources and shelter in places that are now lost beneath the sea. And with that model came new questions. How many groups moved along the Pacific edge? How far apart were they? Did they speak the same language? Did they even know of one another's existence? We do not know, but Monte Verde gave us permission to ask. And in asking, the shape of the American human journey became more nuanced. No longer a single trail of hunters chasing game across the steppes, but a braided path, winding through forests, along beaches, into caves, and across shallow rivers. Some groups may have moved quickly, others slowly. Some stayed, others vanished. In what is now South America, the land narrows, the mountains rise, the climate turns raw and wild. But even here, even this far from Beringia, people lived, settled, tended fire, and remembered their dead. That presence forces us to think differently about what the Americas were, not just endpoints, not margins, but destinations in their own right, landscapes with meaning, pathways with memory. Monte Verde is not just important because it is early. It is important because it feels complete. Not a hunting camp, not a temporary shelter, but a lived-in place where knowledge was passed down through quiet repetition. We often think of sacredness as something built in stone, in size, in permanence. But in Ice Age America, sacredness was often marked by return, by use, by presence. The quiet kind, the kind that does not shout, the kind that leaves behind footprints in soft earth and fibres wrapped in bundles, hidden beneath centuries of peat and moss. In this way, Monte Verde echoes sites like Windover in Florida, where the dead were buried with care in waterlogged silence. It echoes the Great Plains kill sites, where entire groups coordinated not just to survive, but to participate in something greater than themselves. It echoes the Galt site in Texas, where thousands of artifacts lie buried beside one another, as if left behind with purpose. And it reminds us that sacredness in the Americas was often grounded in the land itself, not in walls or symbols, but in the repetition of gesture, the kneeling to start a fire, the weaving of plant fibres into string, the roasting of food beside others who would roast again the next night. That kind of rhythm leaves traces deeper than stone. Monte Verde invites us to see sacredness in the small, in the undisturbed layout of tents, in the sharpened sticks used to support roofs, in the plant remains still curled in the corners of the shelters, in the burned bones left behind by meals shared beside a fire. There is no evidence of hierarchy, no indication of a chief or priest, only community, repetition, intention. These were not people ruled by a vision of expansion or empire. They were people who knew the tides, who read the sky, who carried with them a memory of places far to the north, and who placed that memory into the soil of southern Chile, where it would sleep until the world was ready to listen. And now that we are listening, we begin to see that Monte Verde is not isolated. It is a point in a constellation, a southern temple to echo the northern graves, a campfire still smouldering in the rain. That is what Monte Verde became, a story not just of where people went, but of how far they were willing to carry memory, not for conquest, not for glory, but for continuity. And in that continuity something new began to form. The site sits at the far southern end of the American landmass, just beyond the Andes and not far from the Pacific. From the peat and charcoal and wooden stakes, we can reconstruct a shape, a rhythm, a version of humanity that does not match the fast-burning images we often place on the Ice Age. These people were not racing across the continent, they were planting themselves in it, rooting into soil that was cold, wet, and full of secrets. Listening to the wind as it curled down from the mountains, placing one generation beside another. Monte Verde stretches the human timeline, but more than that, it stretches the imagination. It asks us to consider the possibility that human history in the Americas did not begin with a single crossing or a single culture, but with a long scattered unfolding of paths, some coastal, some inland, some lost, some remembered. And in this long unfolding there are moments that press against the noise of modernity with a kind of quiet clarity. A footprint left by a child in soft clay, a strip of seaweed laid beside a cooking hearth, a tent post still lodged in earth after more than 14,000 years. These are not echoes of chaos, they are echoes of knowing. To reach the end of a continent and build a home is not the end of a journey. It is the beginning of belonging. Monte Verde was not a boundary, it was a seed, a confirmation that wherever people stopped to make fire, to eat, to care, to bury, the land responded by holding those gestures in place. In this way, the Americas became not a frontier, but a memory field, a continent whose sacredness was carried not on monuments, but on the act of returning. The Americas did not need to look like Europe or Asia to carry their own complexity. They did not need stone cities or cave murals to be holy. They had fibre, footprints, flame, and even now, beneath the rush of modern roads and the silence of overgrown fields, the ground still remembers. It remembers not just where humans walked, but how they walked, with patience, with repetition, with hands full of string and roots and shells and time. The land stretched north again, away from the shelter of Monte Verde, away from the fires and tents and seaweed bundles, back toward the heart of a continent once buried beneath ice. How do you remember a world that disappeared beneath your feet? It begins with shape, with a map etched not by borders or cities, but by the hand of retreating glaciers. In what is now the northern half of the United States, the land bears the scars of deep cold, not the kind that brushes the skin and passes, but the kind that stays for tens of thousands of years, the kind that weighs mountains into valleys, that lifts lakes into existence, that presses down the bones of time and leaves behind water where there used to be silence. The Great Lakes are not lakes in the ordinary sense. They are the shadows of glaciers. Their basins were carved by ice over 1 mile thick, dragging stone and sediment as it moved, pausing only to melt, shift, and continue again. Lake Superior is not a basin of peace. It is a wound in the earth made by the slow breath of the Pleistocene, and yet now it reflects the sky. It holds fish. It lulls sleep. A memory made soft. The Mississippi River begins not with a spring but with a melting. Its earliest flow was glacial, wild, borderless, a corridor of rushing water that braided through a raw continent still finding its shape, and along its future banks humans walked. We know this not only because of tools and bones, but because of how consistently they returned to these floodplains, how they camped in the same bends, how they buried their dead above the same banks. The river shaped their roots, and in return, they shaped their memory of the river. Glacial valleys still hold this memory. The driftless area of the upper Midwest, untouched by the last major ice sheet, is ringed by ridges where ice once paused. And in those hills, stories were held. In Ohio, great tunnels of lost soil were blown from glacial plains. In Montana, entire landscapes were washed clean by glacial outburst floods. Every hill and lake and bend has a lineage, not one of human birth alone, but of glacial breath. The land was sculpted by forgetting and remembering, and humans walked through this reshaping. They followed the edges of retreat, not into empty space, but into landscapes just being born. Fresh soil, open sky, animal herds that had never known fear, vegetation sprouting in glacial silt. The land was wounded but generous, hard but new. We find their tools beside old lake shores. We find their footprints in clay pressed down by meltwater. We find their shelters near high terraces that overlooked ancient river routes. But more than anything, we find their paths folded into the Earth's own transformation. It is here, in these carved landscapes, that Ice Age America becomes more than a stage. It becomes the protagonist, not just background, not just setting, but actor, shaper, keeper. Because the land did not simply witness the human story, it moved it forward. It created routes and barriers, traps and havens. It forced adaptation and allowed persistence. It was never neutral, and what it left behind was more than form. It left behind memory, memory in stone, in silt, in water, in the long, slow curves of valleys where the air still feels like a whisper from somewhere older than us. But the deepest memories are not buried in soil. They live in people, in voices, in stories told not once but many times, in languages that carry the shape of land inside their words, in names that describe not only place, but presence. Across what is now North America, indigenous peoples have long spoken of events that modern science once believed to be unknowable. Stories of giant floods, of fire in the sky, of animals that no longer roam, of cold that swallowed the world. These are not metaphors. They are history carried in rhythm and breath, stories as a form of survival. Among the Klamath of the Pacific Northwest, there are oral traditions that describe the eruption of Mount Mazama more than 7,000 years ago, an event confirmed by the presence of volcanic ash across multiple archaeological layers. Among the Inuit and Dene, there are accounts of landscapes shifting, of sea ice arriving where it had never been, of caribou changing their patterns. In the Great Lakes region, Anishinaabe stories speak of long journeys across a cold and dangerous land marked by rivers and stars. And throughout the Mississippi Valley, ancient mounds stand not just as monuments, but as reminders. They are the physical punctuation marks in a longer story, one spoken and remembered, not carved. Many are built atop older landforms shaped by glacial melt, as if the builders recognized the power of what came before. This is not coincidence, it is continuity. Even in the high plateaus of New Mexico and the desert canyons of Arizona, the oral traditions of the Hopi and Zuni speak of migration through elemental change, through water, through fire, through darkness and ice. These are not casual metaphors. They map onto actual geological and climatic events. But more importantly, they map onto the landscape, caves, springs, vistas, pathways that align with memory. To walk these lands with those stories in mind is to see that Ice Age America is not gone. It is encoded, not only in sediments, but in sentences, in ceremonial paths, in songs sung at the right time of year. In the way a river's curve is described, in the name given to a stone outcrop or a canyon that echoes. For these peoples, the land has never stopped speaking. It murmurs in rockfall, it repeats itself in the seasons, and it is listened to, not as myth, but as kin. When the glaciers finally withdrew, they did not leave behind emptiness. They left behind forms, pathways, marks in the stone, and those marks became sacred not because they were old, but because they were remembered. Along the ancient riverbeds that once flowed from the ice margins, people gathered, not to dominate, but to witness. They built mounds where the soil was soft and the water moved slowly. They chose high places for watching, low places for ceremony. In what is now Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in Illinois and Missouri, the land holds shapes, not random, not accidental, effigy mounds in the forms of birds and bears and serpents, curves that follow the horizon, alignments that catch the solstice sun. These shapes were built thousands of years after the Ice Age ended, but they rise from ground made by the glaciers, from till, from outwash, from gravel plains and loess hills. The sacredness is not imposed, it is inherited, and in other places, the memory runs deeper still. In what is now Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound coils across a ridge of land shaped by glacial debris. Its body curves with a rhythm that some say mimics the moon. Others see stars, others see story. Whatever the meaning, it is placed where the earth remembers ice. The builders may not have known the full depth of that memory, but they knew the feeling, the pull of a place that speaks softly but persistently. Farther west, in the high plains of the Dakotas and Montana, medicine wheels mark the land like clocks, stones arranged in circles, spokes pointing outward to align with the horizon. Sunrise, solstice. Migration. These circles do not explain, they observe, they do not conquer, they remain. And in the southwest, petroglyphs carved into canyon walls depict animals long extinct. Mammoths, giant bison, dire wolves. These are not idle drawings, they are echoes. They are reminders that memory lives not just in the people, but in the places they return to. Even caves carry this sense. Though the Americas have fewer cave art sites than Europe, they have something just as powerful. The White Sands footprints in what is now New Mexico are not painted. They are pressed, walked, made by children and adults moving across soft earth beside a drying lake. Frozen in time by layers of gypsum silt, a sacred trace not drawn but stepped, not imagined but lived. These marks matter because they show the land was not abandoned when the ice left. It was inherited, and that inheritance was not wealth or territory. It was meaning, it was attention, it was reverence. The legacy of the Ice Age still moves beneath our feet. We drink from glacial rivers, we drive across moraines, we build cities in the basins once carved by ice. And though we may not always see it, the shape of modern life often follows ancient roots. Our highways shadow animal trails that once guided hunters. Our neighbourhoods rise on high ground chosen for its view over floodplains shaped by meltwater. Our lives curve around memory we did not make. The Mississippi River still snakes south, carrying sediment that first broke free in glacial torrents. The Great Lakes still hold the bones of ancient fish and the ghosts of vanished shorelines. Even the ridgelines that define state boundaries and weather patterns were laid down not by intention, but by ice. 1,000 tiny decisions made by wind and weight and water over millennia. Place names echo this past. Words like Yukon, Missouri, Erie, and Ontario carry indigenous origins that speak not just of location, but of presence, of story. of movement. Even the name Mississippi is derived from an Ojibwe word meaning great river. These names are not labels, they are invitations. They are reminders that the land was known long before it was mapped. And in that knowledge, something subtle continues. Farmers in Iowa plant in soil left by ancient glaciers. The richest farmland in North America owes its fertility to the slow grinding of stone into dust. Vineyards grow where once there was ice. Timber rises where once there was tundra. And even now, weather moves across the continent in patterns shaped by valleys and basins cut by long, vanished ice sheets. The earth does not forget. And sometimes, neither do we. In parks and forests across the northern states, glacial features are named and marked. Kettle lakes, drumlin fields, eskers and erratics. Words that echo the language of geologists, but also something older. Something that recognizes form as story. Children still splash in lakes that began as ice. Families still camp on ridges once pushed upward by frozen weight. We may not know the full timeline, but the shape still carries us. Ice Age. America is not gone. It is just quieter now. It speaks through the way rivers bend, through the shape of shorelines, through the paths animals still follow, even when fenced. And in the quiet corners of fields and forests, where the air cools in strange ways and stones sit oddly in the grass, it waits, in the outline of valleys, in the path of the wind, in the stones that never quite settled where they should have. Ice Age. America is not only behind us, it is beneath us, around us, inside the names we use and the places we pass. Its memory is not fragile. It is folded into the ordinary. We build on it. We live with it. And sometimes, without realizing it, we return to it. We walk the same ridgelines our ancestors walked. We follow creeks and wooded trails that curve in ways shaped by ancient melt. We gather near water without asking why. We call a certain spot beautiful without knowing that it sits on a glacial terrace, lifted gently above the floodplain. The bones of the earth are visible in these quiet patterns. Even the way the fog moves through certain valleys at dawn is part of that deeper inheritance. In what is now Texas, the Gault site holds hundreds of thousands of artifacts layered in river sediment. People return there again and again, from the Ice Age through more recent time. Not because it was dramatic, because it worked, because it had water and stone and shade, because it felt familiar. The same could be said of so many places. Spirit Cave in Nevada, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Topper in South Carolina, Windover in Florida. All of them hold memory, not just in what was left behind, but in where it was left, in the angle of sunlight, in the weight of silence, in the feeling that someone had been there before. And it is not only the objects we find, it is the spaces they shaped, the firing worn smooth by repetition, the worn path between shelter and stream. The stones arranged in a curve that has no functional explanation, only the suggestion of pattern. These are not ruins, they are invitations, to remember, to listen. Sacredness, in the Americas, is often measured not by what rises above the land but by what sinks gently into it. A post hole, a seed, a burn mark in the soil. These things do not shout, they whisper, and the land listens. It listens still, and in the deepest hours we sometimes hear it answer. Because the story of Ice Age America is not only a history, it is a relationship between land and people, between cold and shelter, between forgetting and remembering. The glaciers carved more than rivers. They carved ways of seeing, of moving, of staying. And even now the shape of that seeing remains. We do not walk alone across this continent. We walk in the company of those who came before, not in vision, not in myth, but in rhythm, in breath, in the tilt of a hill that still holds sunrise, in the pattern of a field that still yields what was once planted beside fire. Ice Age. America is not a vanished world, it is a remembered one. Thank you for walking this long road through carved valleys and glacial rivers, fellow sapiens. Thank you for tracing the memory of a continent, from the footprints in clay to the wind over empty plains. If this story brought you stillness, sparked a quiet sense of wonder, or reminded you that deep time still moves within the present, thank you for letting it live inside your evening. Perhaps a single image stayed with you. A lake that was once a wound in the earth, a stone that felt placed, a trail that curved just so. What part of this landscape whispered to you? Whether it was the image of water flowing through ancient riverbeds, the quiet echo of footprints pressed into gypsum, or the enduring sense of land as a keeper of memory, these are the fragments that tether us to something older than language. If one of those fragments stirred something in you, feel free to leave it in the comments as a quiet offering. These stories only grow deeper when shared, and if you found rest in this walk through Ice Age America, feel free to like, subscribe, or stay near. There are still many ancient paths left to wander together. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,